the paradox of God. On the one hand, God has traditionally been understood as transcendent. The transcendence of God means God's the way in which God is beyond comprehension, beyond understanding, beyond intelligibility. God cannot be limited by the human mind in its search for understanding, in the effort of the mind to understand, to comprehend, noble as that may be. God is always finally beyond that comprehension, that horizon of intelligibility. As such, God is hidden. There is something ineffable, unspeakable, beyond words, beyond names about God. Oculus non vidit, nec oris audivit. What no eye has seen, nor ear heard, is how Paul describes God in 1 Corinthians 2:9. Si comprehendus non est Deus. If it is comprehended, it is not God, is what St. Augustine says. This basic strain of theological insight runs through the major monotheisms, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, as well as much of ancient Greek theology, in particular the Pythagorean and Platonic and Neoplatonic strains of thought that run from many centuries before the time of Christ into the early centuries of the first millennium. So that's already like a lot of varied worldviews and perspectives there, unified under this basic insight. And the insight is this point, this monad hopefully represents the idea visually quite well. This point of ineffability, this point which is beyond comprehension, this point which cannot be got at, this point that is beyond. To forget this in our theology, a theology which was ignorant of this point, would succumb to a kind of hubris, a kind of arrogance, a kind of pride, inasmuch as it would then say, well, what I comprehend, how I understand it, is identical with the nature of the divinity. And so this is why there is the constant refrain in these great traditions towards this point about ineffability, transcendence, and like the Godhead being ultimately beyond comprehension. So, because I think there's a danger around pride and hubris, and the pride and hubris of the human intellect itself, which is seeking answers, which is seeking to comprehend, which is seeking to render intelligible. This strain of theology is also known as apophatic theology or negative theology. And what that means is just that the way to speak of God, if we do at all, is through negation, denying qualities and names and words which we attribute to God, denying those and saying God is not this, God is not that, God is not. Is the via negativa, the negative way. And this is why this point, this ineffable point, this sort of absence is represented here visually, and it's so important in this theological strain, which wants to emphasize the ultimate transcendence of God, and always remember that and always keep it in mind. Because, as I've suggested, to fail to keep it in mind is possibly, potentially, to succumb to a kind of hubris, kind of pride, kind of inflation of the human intellect as God, as supreme. Now I understand what God is. Now I know finally that this concept I have, this is God. And Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the ancient Greek theologies, they all have in them this refrain. There are traditions in the Western esotericism, particularly I'm thinking of the Chaldean oracles, the wisdom attributed to ancient Babylon, which were circulated amongst the Neoplatonists in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. The theology of Zoroaster, Pythagoras, the Egyptians. Like there are many strains of thought which would suggest that they all held to this same monadic principle, this one which is beyond all multiplicity. The degree to which this is present in Eastern systems is something I'm not going to comment on in this presentation because I'd like to keep it fairly brief. But I think it would be sufficient to say that in Hinduism and Buddhism, an analogous concept might be found, but I won't go into that now. By contrast, you see, like on the complete other hand, we have the idea of the immanence or the revelation of God. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God, and whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. And that's 1 John 4, 7 through 8. So here we have a very clear identifier of God, a very clear name of God. And the author here is saying, God is love. Very simple identification here. If you know love, then you know God. There is a likeness between love and God. There is something about the quality of love which is like God. Indeed, the statement God is love makes them identical. What is implied there is that they are the same thing, they are of the same essence. But even if you didn't want to go that strong, the idea of a likeness and affinity between a relationship between some quality of our world and the divine is another very important theological current, which is, as opposed to negative theology, positive theology, cataphatic theology, which is going to say something positive about the divine nature. God is love, for example. God is justice, for example. God is truth. These kinds of claims are doing something quite different from what I've just discussed in the apophatic branch of theology. Because obviously implicit in this is the idea that we can comprehend something, at least, about God. And that something might be, in the mystery of love, for example. So we have a challenge, we have a problem here, because according to the law of non-contradiction, contradictory propositions cannot both be true in the same sense at the same time. Proposition 1 is that God is not comprehensible. And proposition 2 is that God is comprehensible. Comprehensible here meaning intelligible or able to be understood. That term comprehensible is being used in the same sense in both P1 and P2. So which is it? Which is it? If the negative theology, this branch of the transcendence of God is true, then nothing we can say or think can be identified with God. We can say nothing intelligible about God whatsoever if P1 is true. By contrast, if P2 is true, then God is comprehensible, but then perhaps we feel this same danger that I mentioned at the beginning, that maybe now we have a kind of hubris or pride of the intellect in saying that God is love. I understand what love is. I understand what God is. And now God, the creator of all things, the source and origin and end of all things, is now something that is I have defined, I have comprehended, I've got it. That's what God is. And we might feel that that's a pretty dangerous place for someone to be in, to be an aspect, part of this wonderful, vast cosmos, and to say that I have now enclosed its creator, source, origin, and end into my mind, into this concept, into this box, into this definition that I have. I've got it. I've got God. Like, done. So, we might find both propositions problematic in their respective ways. But if we hold to the logical law of non-contradiction, then one of these has to budge, doesn't it? Yeah, so according to the law of non-contradiction, it's either or here, really. Because if God is not comprehensible, then theology, which is what this little presentation is concerned with, is futile. The study of the nature of God is entirely futile. No theologian in the whole of human history has said anything meaningful, intelligible at all, because theology has no subject matter whatsoever, since God is not comprehensible. God is unintelligible. Thus, theologia, uh, reasoned, intelligent reasoning about theos, God, is a futile activity, a futile project. And then B, as I've just explained, if God is comprehensible, then we run into that same danger that I've mentioned. God is not transcendent. God is something that can be defined and put into a comprehensible box by the human intellect. So if, however, we say, if however we want to say that both P1 and P2 are true, that is, that God is not comprehensible and God is comprehensible, that it is not a question of either or, but both and, then we must admit to the fundamentally paradoxical nature of God. Now, it depends how you see this, right? Because you could say the contradictory nature of God. If we were to grant both of these propositions as being true, and the word comprehensible, the word God, the terms here are meant in the same sense in both propositions. We want to say they're both true. Well, that's a contradiction, isn't it? We don't have a law of non-contradiction. We haven't eliminated the contradiction. We've admitted it. We've just said, well, this, and they are the negations of each other. They're the opposites of each other. But, that's how it is. We shrug our shoulders at it. So, I mean, I wanted to keep this presentation relatively short, as I've been doing recently, and I'm aware that it's a huge topic, the nature of God, the transcendence of God, the immanence of God, and that many have devoted their lives really to this question. And that, in a way, all of the major religions of the world, or many of them, are wrestling with this tension, this question, this paradox, this contradiction maybe one could meaningfully distinguish between a paradox and contradiction, but maybe that's a topic for another time, or I'd be interested to think through a bit what that would mean. But paradox is basically something that is seemingly contradictory yet true. And if we go back and we say that we have good reasons for thinking that P1 and P2 are true, both of them, then, we've either got to say that God, whatever God is, somehow transcends even the law of non-contradiction, is beyond even the limitations of what is logically implied here by this law, beyond even that. In which case, God is a paradox, God is beyond, and yet holding sort of contradictory aspects. God holds these contradictory aspects within. Or we say, no, the law of non-contradiction, this logical law, must hold. And if we say that, then we have to eliminate one of these propositions. And I don't think that we really will want to do that if we want to practice theology, for example, thinking about the intelligible reality of God. Anyway, so the point is just that I've tried to set up a basic problem, and I'm not trying to offer solutions here. I'm trying to articulate the problem as clearly as I can. And the problem is, on the one hand, the transcendence and the hiddenness, actually, of God. The hiddenness of God. And this negative theology, this apophatic strain of thought, one could argue, is the undercurrent which can the branch from which atheism itself grows, because atheism is just saying there is no God, negating God's existence. And an apophatic theologian is going to say, well, God is always a negation. God is always something that is not. And so if I continue to say, well, God is not this, 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 and that's my entire style, my entire way, the negative way of my theology, then one could see how atheism is entirely consistent with that approach to the question of God. Bit of a side tangent, but interesting anyway. So we have the transcendence of God and the hiddenness of God on the one hand, and we have the immanence and the revelation of God on the other hand. I didn't speak so much about revelation, but the idea of God revealing himself as intelligible in some way, as truth or justice or love, saying this is what I am, and if you know this, then you know me, and you can see by contrast what is not me and what is evil and such like that. So there's a sort of going up branch or strain, there's a going down branch or strain, a hiddenness, a revelation, a transcendence, an immanence, and a heavenly and an earthly direction to theology. These are the two major branches of theology which really provide the basic framework for within which theology can be conducted. And trying to reconcile these, bring them together, reckon them with one another, like get these to fit into a whole worldview is the challenge for any theologian thinking about God. Yeah, I might leave it there. Thanks for listening. I would love to hear any comments. I'd love to hear any thoughts, any questions, any criticisms about this. This is something that I've thought about for a while and have sought to understand more thoroughly. And it's it seems like something very deep is being said, of course, because it's talking about the nature of God, but to speak candidly, like I feel like I would want to say both things. I would want to affirm both P1 and P2, both propositions. I would want to say that there is definitely a sense in which God, whatever we mean by that word, is beyond any human meaning, any human intelligible category, beyond the horizon of the human mind, full stop. That must be so. God is essentially mysterious, unknowable, incomprehensible in that sense. I would want to say that's true. And on the other hand, I would want to say that even so, there are things which can be said about God. For example, truth, goodness, beauty, love, that these things do exist and are real, and that they either are identical with or provide a strong analogy to God, what that term means. A sublime beauty gives one a sense of what God is, for example. I would want to affirm that as being true as well. And so there's a tension, there's a problem, and there's a desire for me personally to reconcile this tension and resolve the problem. One could think about it in the imagery of the sun, which, is so brilliant, so bright that the human eye cannot stare directly into it. You can't look into it really without going blind. And so that captures its transcendence in its ineffability, the way in which there's always a hidden aspect that you can't really see, can't really quite get at. There's always some transcendence to the sun. And yet, what have you seen without it? I mean, we have lights these days, which are sort of likenesses of the sun, but the primordial light, at least here on Earth, is the sun, which rises each day and provides us with our light and provides the moon with light. So, like, what have you seen without the sun? All is seen by its light. And so it reveals with its light and conceals with its light at the same time. Thank you so much for listening. I've got a Patreon link in the description if you'd like to support the channel. And I'd love to hear your comments, and stay tuned for more content. Thanks for listening.